Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Job numbers just turned in the best December in history for native-born Americans who do not work for the federal government. Was legacy media lying all this time about the job crisis? On Friday, the infamous BLS released job numbers for December, estimating 50,000 jobs were created on the month. Legacy media painted this as weak, but it was right in the middle of JP Morgan's forecast. Brings year-on-year growth to 2 million jobs for native-born Americans. In other words, the weak job stories legacy media has been peddling all year is deportations and laid-off federal workers. These may be parasites, but BLS counts them as jobs. So December unemployment dropped to 4.4%. November unemployment was also revised down from the 4.6 that had left-wing media fantasizing about the Great Depression. Interestingly, unemployment for blacks and Hispanics, or Latinx, if you are a Democrat, plunged more than 0.5% in the past 2 months, which makes sense since they are picking up a lot of their jobs vacated by illegals. Beyond the headlines, there was a lot to love. Wage growth jumped to 3.8% year-on-year. That's up from 3.6% last month. There was a massive 300,000 person improvement in U6 unemployment, which counts so-called discouraged workers who want jobs but are not looking. There was a 500,000 drop in multiple job holders, meaning people are getting paid enough they don't have to drive for Uber. They can do movie night with the kids. The previous month's concerning swing from full-time to part-time fully reversed, meaning fewer people are stuck in part-time work when they want a real job. Zero Hedge summed it up as a, quote, Goldilocks report, which is pretty good considering government jobs accounted for just 4% of gains last month. Some months under Biden, it was a third or half of job gains. This report, 96% were private sector real jobs. So as next, if 25 closes out Goldilocks, 26 is set to get even better. We've got a flood of cash coming in from Fed rate cuts, Fed QE, where they print money and buy stuff, injecting it into the economy, and now a fresh $200 billion coming from Trump, directing Fannie Mae to dump it into mortgage markets, which promotes home purchases. All on top of trillions coming into reshore production under Trump's big, beautiful tariff umbrella, and a massive AI data center build-out, massive as in dollars going into data center real estate, just top dollars going into office real estate. So jobs are on fire. Growth is off the charts. The last piece that needs fixing is inflation, the dreaded affordability crisis. According to Truflation, who samples thousands of real-world prices, inflation is finally coming down below 2%, but that's going to bump up against all that cash and Fed money that may not boost inflation this year, but is lining it up for 27 or 28. Meantime, unless you are a Fed or an illegal or a journalist, there's plenty of jobs, and they're finally paying a living wage. Last week, Donald Trump announced he will ban Wall Street institutional investors who buy up homes and rent them back to Americans. Will Americans own something and be happy? Now, Trump's goal is to lower house prices by preventing Wall Street outbidding the rest of us with the cheap capital they get, but we do not. It's something a lot of Americans have been wanting, from the MAGA base to the Bernie bros. So homeownership is good because it promotes starting families, it promotes community involvement, and it lets people build a nest egg. A recent study found the average net worth of an American homeowner is about $400,000. The average net worth of a renter is $10,000. $10,000 being a pretty thin retirement. The problem, of course, is Americans cannot afford houses that skyrocketed 40% under Biden. Toss in Fed rate hikes that doubled mortgage rates, and according to Bankrate, the median monthly mortgage went from $1,200 a month in 2019 to $2,200 a month last year, with rents along for the ride since landlords too have mortgages. Meanwhile, wages for 20-somethings, prime family age, actually went down under Biden and have only partway recovered. This all put institutional investors in the spotlight who've been quietly hoovering up millions of homes to rent. That accelerated dramatically during COVID's low interest rates. At one point, institutions were buying 1 in 4 single-family homes. Now, banning institutions will lower prices, but not by much since they only own a couple percent of houses. So you might get a 5% drop in home prices, maybe closer to 10% in Sunbelt cities where institutions are most active. But this comes with a roughly equal rise in rents since Blackstone will be out of the rental business. So slightly cheaper houses, slightly higher rent. Both nudge people into owning at the expense of people with crap credit or no down payment. Moreover, we're talking 5% tops here when houses went up 40% and housing costs doubled. So buyers need a lot more. Now, Trump's been trying everything. He did an EO to reduce closing costs, simplify building codes, removing tariffs on construction materials, tax incentives for builders, even 50-year mortgages, and opening federal land to housing. Just last week, he deployed $200 billion from Fannie Mae to lower mortgage rates. And of course, deportations, which have opened up over 1 million houses and are finally lowering rents, especially in deportation-heavy cities like Austin. What's missing is the two biggest drivers of house inflation, which is inflation, driven by federal deficits, and mass deregulation in home building, including environmental mandates, zoning, and rent control. The National Association of Home Builders estimates can add $94,000 to the cost of a home. For these, he needs Congress, along with local governments like New York or San Francisco, where rent control has left over 100,000 empty units, despite nosebleed rents that just delivered New York to Comrade Mamdani. So as next, affordability and inflation have been the top voter frustration all year. Prediction market Ecology currently has 77% odds the GOP loses the House in the midterms over them. Trump is doing what he can, but Congress has to do the heavy lifting if they want to keep their seats. A word from our sponsor. If you own gold, and many of you do, you already understand how it protects your wealth from the insanity coming out of Washington. The inflation, the recessions, the wars. But with monetary metals, there's a way to actually earn a yield of up to 4% on your gold paid in more ounces of gold. You retain ownership of real, allocated physical gold with no storage costs while your ounces grow every month outside the banking system. If you're serious about protecting your future and building your legacy, head to monetarymetals.com/Peter to get started. Now back to our show. The Federal Reserve has gone rogue against the elected president. Perhaps it is time to shut down the federal counterfeiter. On Monday, Fed Chair Jerome Powell released a video that looked all the world like a hostage video, but probably was not. In it, he complained about the Department of Justice serving him with a subpoena for lying about his $2.5 billion renovation of the Fed headquarters. By the way, that's the cost of 2.5 football stadiums. Powell cast it as, quote, intimidation over monetary policy and interest rates, an attack on the Fed's alleged independence from voters. The kicker is the Fed should be prosecuted for monetary policy, as in lying to Congress is a minor crime when the Fed should be prosecuted for 113 years of counterfeiting, 14 recessions, a half-dozen financial crises, and one Fed-funded totalitarian deep state. Originally established in 1913 to protect the dollar and the economy, the Fed, of course, has destroyed both. The dollar buys just 3 cents what it did in 1913. We've had 14 recessions, one every 8 years like clockwork, roughly every other festooned with a financial crisis complete with a bailout paid by you. The recessions are the Fed's boom-bust machine where it prints money hand over fist to spark a tissue fire boom, which makes it rain on Wall Street and buys the next election. Then when the money printing sparks inflation, they slam the brakes, throwing the economy into recession. Now, these recessions have cost trillions of lost wealth and tens of millions of layoffs, bankruptcies, crushed businesses, wiped out life savings. One Lancet study found the 2008 crisis alone drove 5,000 suicides from these causes. Multiply that by 14 recessions. Worse, the Fed almost single-handedly funded the deep state, printing money to finance everything from FDR's New Deal to the 1960s welfare state to endless wars, and of course COVID lockdowns, which never could have happened without the Fed's $6.5 trillion blank check. A blank check we paid for with double-digit inflation that Powell dismissed as transitory, then waited till after his confirmation to start fixing, which required jacking rates so hard it wiped out a half dozen banks and froze the American housing market in carbonite so that 20-somethings live in mom's basement instead of starting a family. So the Fed has a lot to answer for. Still, the Fed has a lot of defenders because it does something that's very useful to the elite. It makes credit artificially cheap. This floods profits to Wall Street. It throws money at rich people in corporate America who get cheap loans the rest of us do not. Most important, it subsidizes federal borrowing so Washington can effectively bid away and apparently give to Somalis everything the American people have built. So as next, if Powell is convicted of a crime, Trump can replace him before his term ends in May. After the video, odds of Powell leaving early jumped on Kalshi but are now back down to 10%, so he will probably stick around. More important is what this does to the Fed itself. Fed independence has always been a joke. In reality, they dump cheap money on Democrats while slamming the brakes on the Reagans and the Trumps with rate hikes. With the Fed now in open revolt, we may get some erosion in the Fed's ability to manipulate the economy with zero political oversight, meaning zero voter oversight. Trump's now smashed open the Overton window to start having a discussion. Why do we have an unconstitutional counterfeiter that destroys our life savings and repeatedly feeds our economy and our lives through a wood chipper to amuse and enrich Wall Street? Minnesota Governor Tim Walz was one election day water leak away from being vice president. Now he's resigning and facing impeachment over industrial-scale fraud, leaving Somali daycares without a sitting governor for the first time in 7 years. Last week, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz dropped out of the governor's race, citing family pressures, which sometimes means Somali stole $9 billion while donating to your friends, and now the FBI is interested. This comes after Donald Trump surged 2,000 agents to Minneapolis to investigate industrial-scale fraud that has apparently stolen more than the GDP of Somalia. Still, there's a lot more to Tim Walz than Somali fraud. Elected just before COVID, Walz first gained national prominence when he instructed police to shoot regular Minnesotans with paintballs for being on their porch during curfew. In fact, he suggested neighbors shoot violators because that is Minnesota nice. Walz's authoritarian streak flipped during the BLM riots, where he took a knee instead of arresting rioters, standing down the National Guard to let the rioters cook, fiery yet mostly peaceful. When the smoke cleared, entire blocks of Minneapolis lay in ruins, over 1,000 businesses were looted. Total damage was north of $500 million. This also inspired riots in other cities that led to dozens of deaths. Now, with police stood down, regular crime soared in Minneapolis, what had once been one of America's safest major cities. In just 2 years, violent crime jumped 42%, homicides jumped 60%. Walz's response was swift. He surged tampons to boys' bathrooms, legalized abortion literally after birth, the old one-leg rule, and provided in-state tuition and free Medicaid for legal, so they vote for him. Walz ratcheted taxes to make room for a 65% hike in state spending, including hikes to income tax, payroll tax, vehicle tax, and grocery delivery. Between crime and taxes, Minnesota's economy languished, ranking 39th in job growth, 46th in household income growth, and losing almost 50,000 residents fleeing to other states, replaced with immigrants getting free Medicaid. And of course, what triggered that family time, a whole lot of welfare fraud, including an estimated $9 billion to Somalis. Plucky journalist Nick Shirley, who brought the Somali fraud to nationwide attention, crowed on X, quote, "I ended Tim Walz," adding, "You should have put Minnesota first when you had the chance." So as next, in the near term, not much changes for Minnesota. The impeachment will fail since it needs Democrat votes to pass, so Tim Walz will probably run out his final months. At which point, failed presidential candidate Amy Klobuchar will probably run for governor. She's 84% to run on prediction market Kalshi. She'll run as a moderate since Minnesota is a purple state, meaning aside from Somalis. But going by her presidential campaign, she is Tim Walz in a dress. Given Minnesota's lax voter ID laws and generous benefits for illegals who vote and Somalis who donate, she'll win unless Trump's deportations and fraud prosecutions can make a dent in Democrats' vote machine. Till that happens, in Minnesota, in a clutch of voter fraud states, it's new clowns, same as the old ones. A word from our sponsor. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada and they're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. You can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. Okay, back to our show. The Atlanta Fed just announced GDP growth is a blistering 5.5%, meaning we are currently growing faster than China. Will Chinese have to teach their kids English? New numbers from the Trump-hating Fed admit we are in a Reagan-level boom, even as legacy media keeps pimping the Trump depression. Such as growth, unemployment's down to 4.4%, wages are up nearly 4% on the year. Even inflation is down below 2% as the economy grows even faster than Congress can spend it. Challenger Gray says layoffs are at the lowest since 2022, so much for the AI job demolition. Services, which make up 80% of American jobs, are actually accelerating. Then the big one, productivity growth. This is the most important number for economists because it's literally how you get rich. It's currently running higher than 90% of the time since Reagan took office. So productivity measures how much you produce for how much you put in, how much capital, how many workers it takes to make how much stuff. It's the gold standard for prosperity since the more famous GDP includes a lot of weird stuff. For example, GDP counts welfare for illegals or Somali daycares. As wealth generating, it counts riots as wealth since you got to rebuild. It counts wars, which is why people think blowing stuff up makes you rich. As Elon famously pointed out, if you fire every auto worker in America and replace them with DMV workers at twice the pay, you raise GDP. Productivity, in contrast, is actual wealth. It's the tightest link to wages since a productive economy has to pay people more or they quit. So productivity captures technology, skills, know-how. It also measures how much regulation is hurting growth, which is probably why governments like GDP better, aside from counting welfare and DMV salaries. Most important, it's productivity that predicts future living standards. Will our kids be richer than we are? There's a big reason why the Biden economy looks so good on paper but was so bad in reality. So over his 4 years, Biden's GDP growth was a healthy 3%. But productivity growth was crawling at just half that as GDP ballooned with trillions of deficit spending that in some states meant nearly all job growth over those 4 years was government funded. Trump has now almost tripled Biden's productivity. And concretely, at Trump's current productivity rate, it takes just 14 years to double wages, as in your kids would make 4 times what you make if it keeps up. So as next, last year I predicted strong growth for 2026. So far, it's even better than I expected. That's before we get the millions of jobs coming in from a now inflationary Fed and a flood of incoming foreign investment to get inside Trump's big, beautiful tariff umbrella. The last big item on the economic to-do list is affordability. Trump is throwing the executive order kitchen sink at housing, mortgages, healthcare, and food. But there's only so much he can do when Congress controls inflationary deficit spending and inflationary regulations like permits blocking energy. If Congress finally grows a pair, Americans will start feeling pretty good about the economy, maybe even good enough that Republicans keep their jobs in November's midterm elections. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode and go to petersaintange.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.